I do what he does, the things that you can't fool and the things that you can fool people with. And you'd be a fool not to. I mean, every actor would want to work with Brando.
Jack Nicholson has always been fearless about speaking his mind. With a career spanning decades and some of the most unforgettable roles in film history, he's worked with almost everyone in Hollywood. But not every collaboration was a dream. And now, at 88, Nicholson has finally admitted which actors he simply could not stand. This isn't gossip. These are the names that made him miserable. The people who turned legendary sets into personal nightmares. And once you hear the stories, you'll never see those films the same way again. The first name on his list is shocking, because it belonged to his hero, Marlon Brando. For Nicholson, Brando wasn't just another actor. He was the reason actors even believed they could be artists. Brando's raw power in A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather created an entirely new language for acting. To Nicholson, Brando was untouchable until they actually worked together. In 1976, when the two titans shared the screen in the Missouri Breaks, it should have been magic. Nicholson thought he was about to create history alongside his idol. Instead, it was chaos. Nicholson later confessed in Rolling Stone that Brando's presence was intoxicating. He said that even while acting beside him, he couldn't stop wanting to imitate him. But what started as admiration turned into disbelief. Brando was no longer the sharp, disciplined genius he had once worshipped. He showed up unprepared, disinterested, and shockingly careless. He didn't bother memorizing his lines. He demanded cue cards be taped to props, to lamps, even to his co-stars' foreheads. Nicholson joked that Brando would read dialogue off a banana if he could. And it wasn't just laziness, it was indulgence. Brando played with accents, wore random costumes like dresses and bonnets, and sabotaged scenes just to amuse himself. The director was baffled. The crew was exhausted. And Nicholson? He was devastated. "I came to work to create something," he once said. He came to entertain himself. It wasn't a performance, it was a private party, and the rest of us weren't invited. The film flopped, but for Nicholson, the real wound was deeper. He realized his idol had become, in his own words, a parody of himself. He was a genius, Nicholson admitted, but a lazy one. And lazy genius is just a fancy word for fraud. At the time, Nicholson was riding high off One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, focused, hungry, and determined to prove himself. Seeing Brando unravel was like staring into a mirror he never wanted. He made a choice then. He would never let himself become that. Still, despite the disappointment, part of him could never let go of the mythology. When Brando died in 2004, Nicholson said simply, "He was the most talented actor. I loved him, and I miss him." Was that forgiveness, closure, or just one last performance? Only Nicholson knows. But he never forgot the lesson. Never meet your heroes, especially when they've stopped being heroic. The second name on Nicholson's list wasn't about betrayal, but something quieter and more haunting. Shelley Duvall. In 1980, The Shining turned the Overlook Hotel into one of the most terrifying places in cinema. But behind the scenes, it became the stage for one of Hollywood's most painful pairings. Nicholson and Duvall weren't enemies in the usual sense. There were no public feuds, no dramatic confrontations. What grew between them was something subtler, an unspoken tension, born out of sheer survival. And the man responsible for it was Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick was known for his obsessive perfectionism, but on The Shining, that obsession became something darker. Scenes were filmed over and over, sometimes more than 100 times. Duvall was forced to cry for 12 hours straight, 5 or 6 days a week, until her body and spirit were breaking. It was almost unbearable, she later admitted. After months of emotional torture, critics barely mentioned her performance. The spotlight went to Kubrick, as if she hadn't even existed. Nicholson, by contrast, thrived in the fire. Jack Torrance demanded rage, mania, and a constant sense of explosion, and Nicholson had the training to channel that energy straight into the lens. But working alongside Shelley Duvall, that was where things unraveled. She was under pressure. "Sure, we all were," Nicholson admitted later. Stanley was a general waging war, and we were his soldiers in the trench. But my God, she brought the storm with her every morning. For Nicholson, acting was like a dance. You needed a partner, someone steady enough to move with you, even in chaos. But Duvall, broken by Kubrick's relentless cruelty, often felt like she was hearing an entirely different song. One take could be brilliant, the next completely lost. It was disorienting, even destabilizing. Nicholson never hated her. That's the part people misunderstand. His frustration wasn't personal. It was the artistic chaos, the way Kubrick pushed her past her breaking point, then left her to drown in it. In truth, Duvall was the casualty, not the problem. And while she never lashed out at Nicholson publicly, her silence spoke volumes. She carried that pain quietly for decades, even as critics mocked her. She was nominated for Worst Actress at the very first Razzies in 1981, a cruel insult that the awards later rescinded in 2022 after the truth of her suffering came to light. Years later, Nicholson softened. I respect her. I truly do. What Stanley put her through was unconscionable. That shoot was brutal for both of us. The film is a masterpiece, but it's built on the wreckage of our sanity. I just wish it hadn't been so hard on her. It was the closest he came to admitting what really happened. He never hated Shelley Duvall, but he couldn't work with her either. Their energies were misaligned, their pain too raw, their methods incompatible. Together, they made one of the greatest horror films in history, but at a terrible cost. When Duvall passed away in 2025, Nicholson didn't issue a public statement, but those close to him say he was deeply shaken. They went through hell together, one longtime friend said. And in their own way, they made peace with it, not with words, but with time. And then came Tom Cruise. On paper, A Few Good Men should have been cinematic lightning. Nicholson delivering one of the most iconic monologues in history. Roaring, "You can't handle the truth." Across a military courtroom, while opposite him stood Hollywood's golden boy, young, hungry, unstoppable. But behind the camera, there was no bond, no spark, just a widening rift between two men who believed in completely different versions of acting and of truth itself. Number 4. Faye Dunaway. The nickname Jack gave her was Dread, and years later, it would feel less like a joke and more like a warning. On screen, their chemistry was explosive. In Chinatown back in 1974, Nicholson and Dunaway created one of Hollywood's most unforgettable pairings. J.J. Gitz and Evelyn Mulray weren't just characters. They were fire colliding, raw, electric, impossible to look away from. The film became a classic, showered with Oscar nominations and critical acclaim. But behind the noir glow, something fragile was breaking. Dunaway had a stormy relationship with director Roman Polanski, once even storming off set after he yanked a hair from her head mid-scene. Nicholson was her calming force then, the one who smoothed things over, the one who nicknamed her the dreaded Dunaway. At the time, it sounded almost affectionate. But affection has a way of souring. Fast forward nearly 20 years. Nicholson was now directing The Two Jakes, the long-awaited sequel to Chinatown. He wanted the old spark back, so he brought Dunaway in. But this time, the spark was a fuse, and it blew. Nicholson later admitted she was impossible, always late, always combative, always questioning every line, not to make the film better, but to test control. What he felt from her wasn't collaboration, it was sabotage. Their clashes became infamous on set. Nicholson even rewrote scenes to minimize her role, avoiding the nuclear option of firing her outright. The trust they once had was gone, replaced by a Cold War where every word was a negotiation. The film flopped. Critics called it a hollow ghost of the original. Nicholson never directed another film again. Dunaway years later looked back with a mix of candor and nostalgia. She spoke openly about her battles with bipolar disorder, her relentless perfectionism, and her tendency to push every performance to the edge. She even recalled how, in Chinatown, she had asked Nicholson to really slap her in that infamous scene because she wanted the moment to feel real. It worked, and they earned their accolades. But the bruises, both physical and emotional, stayed long after. They were never enemies in the tabloid sense. No screaming headlines, no lawsuits, no public mudslinging. Instead, what lingered was something far colder. Silence. Decades of it. No more films together, no red carpet photos, no friendly mentions. Just a quiet, bitter absence where a legendary partnership used to be. And that silence might be the saddest feud of all, because what once made them great together was also what made them impossible to survive together. For Jack, dread became a scar. For Faye, Jack became a chapter she closed but never quite finished. But if Dunaway's clashes were about power, Jack's next feud was about something even more personal, the very craft of acting itself, and it came from someone just as intense, just as uncompromising. Sean Penn? According to Sean Penn, their off-screen tension wasn't just about the movie. It felt, and that silence might be the saddest feud of all, because what once made them great together was also what made them impossible to survive together. For Jack, dread became a scar. For Faye, Jack became a chapter she closed but never quite finished. But if Dunaway's clashes were about power, Jack's next feud was about something even more personal, the very craft of acting itself. And it came from someone just as intense, just as uncompromising, Sean Penn. According to Sean Penn, their off-screen tension wasn't just about the movie. It followed them onto the press tour in the strangest way imaginable, a ride with Vladimir Putin. At the Moscow Film Festival, Nicholson, Penn, and Putin ended up in the same convoy racing through rural Russian villages. Locals were shoved aside by armed escorts as black cars tore past, leaving behind chaos and fear. Penn later described it as needlessly aggressive, a moment that gave him a cold, ugly feeling. Nicholson, ever the diplomat, tried smoothing it over. He even joked about giving Putin a producer credit on a future project. Penn wasn't laughing. He later called Putin a creepy little bully and would use that moment as fuel in his activism years later. But insiders say it wasn't really about Putin. It was about what that car ride symbolized. Two men trapped in the same vehicle, headed in the same direction, yet seeing the world in completely different ways. Penn, the soldier. Nicholson, the jazzman. Eventually, one of them walked out of the room. There was never a public falling out. No fiery interviews, no headlines, just silence. Nicholson never directed again after The Two Jakes. He never returned to the stripped-down, actor-driven dramas like The Pledge. And Penn? He dove deeper into activism and independent filmmaking. Two giants, once in sync, now permanently apart. But Jack's next clash wasn't with another director. It was with someone from a younger generation, a rising star who had already become Hollywood's golden boy. Leonardo DiCaprio, making the audience feel like anything could happen, even you. So when Martin Scorsese cast Nicholson opposite DiCaprio in The Departed, it looked perfect on paper. The master of chaos versus the master of precision. Fire meeting ice. And on screen, the results were unforgettable. Nicholson as Frank Costello, a mob boss so unpredictable he felt like a grenade with the pin already pulled. DiCaprio as Billy Costigan, a young cop living in constant terror of being exposed. Their scenes were electric, but not all of that tension was scripted. In one infamous moment, Nicholson pulled a real gun out of nowhere during a take. It wasn't in the script. Scorsese hadn't planned it. And DiCaprio's fear? That was real. Scorsese kept the cameras rolling, capturing one of the most raw, authentic reactions of Leo's career. Nicholson later explained it bluntly. Leo's a craftsman, he said. He builds performances brick by brick, perfect and flawless. But you can see every brick. I don't want to see bricks. I want to see a house that might collapse at any second. To Nicholson, DiCaprio was too controlled, too intellectual, too safe. To him, it felt like trying to improvise with a metronome. And yet, DiCaprio spoke of Jack with reverence. He called him a mentor, a legend, a living masterclass. He admitted Jack scared him on set in character, and sometimes out of it. But instead of resenting it, Leo embraced it. That fear fueled his performance. The movie turned out brilliantly, Critics and fans called it one of the best films of the 2000s. But Nicholson walked away unsettled. "We got a great movie," he reportedly said, "but never again." After The Departed, Nicholson slowly drifted out of Hollywood. His last film was in 2010. Since then, he's lived in near seclusion, showing up only at the occasional Lakers game. Meanwhile, DiCaprio soared Inception, The Revenant, an Oscar win, worldwide fame, and global activism. But one thing was missing: calls to Jack. Friends say DiCaprio rarely checks in anymore. For Nicholson, a man who built his career on loyalty and old-school bonds, that silence stings. There's no headline feud between the two, no dramatic interviews. Just the quiet ache of being forgotten by the very people who once called you a mentor. And maybe that's the real truth about Jack Nicholson's feuds. They weren't about gossip or publicity. They were about loyalty, trust, and respect, things that mattered more to him than fame ever did. So now the question is yours. Were you surprised by the names on this list? Did any of these stories change how you see Jack Nicholson or the actors he clashed with? Was Jack being too harsh, or was he just brutally honest in a town that rarely tells the truth? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more unfiltered Hollywood stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap that bell. You don't want to miss what's coming next.